The morning of October 14th, 1919, started the way most mornings did on a construction site in Decatur, Illinois. Cold, gray. The kind of autumn air that turns your breath to steam before it hits the ground. Site foreman Raymond Calder had been watching the International Harvester Titan 1020 move since before sunrise, hauling gravel aggregate along the northern edge of the foundation excavation. The pit was deep, nearly 14 feet at its lowest point. Shuts in the tractor, all 5,700 pounds of it, was running closer to the edge than anyone should have allowed. Then the edge gave way. The Titan went in nose first. The right front wheel dropped into the crumbling bank, and then the weight did the rest. 5,700 pounds of cast iron, kerosene engine, and exposed flywheel disappeared into the foundation pit in about 2 seconds flat. The crew stood there in silence. The foreman walked to the edge, and he looked down at the tractor resting at roughly a 30-degree angle against the pit wall, its two-cylinder engine still idling. Nobody said a word. Then somebody said the one word everyone was thinking. How? Here's what makes this story remarkable. Not the fall itself, but what came next. Because the man who answered that question wasn't the foreman, and it wasn't the equipment operator who had just climbed out of the cab with nothing but a bruised elbow and a shattered sense of professional confidence. The man who answered that question was the project architect, Arthur Glenwood Haas, and his answer would permanently seal a 5,700-pound piece of farm machinery into the foundation of a commercial building that stood for the next 62 years. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange. Your way of saying this reached me. Not about the action's size, but its meaning. Hit it if this resonated, drop a like if it moved you, and comment your thoughts on this story. Let's complete this circle together. Now, back to that pit. The Titan 10-20 had entered production at International Harvester's plant in 1916. It was a machine built for the reality of American farm work. Not elegant, not refined, but brutally effective. The horizontal two-cylinder engine ran on kerosene distillate and produced 20 horsepower at the belt. The drawbar rating was 10 horsepower, which is exactly where the model designation came from. Operators who climb it aboard for the first time were always struck by how exposed everything was. The flywheel, the push rod, the fuel tank sitting right there in the open. There was no cab, no enclosure, no pretense of operator comfort. You sat on a steel seat, held a cast iron steering wheel, and you worked. By 1919, the Titan 10-20 had become a fixture on construction sites across the Midwest. Farms had them for belt work and field tillage. Contractors had them for hauling, grading, and aggregate movement. They were common, reliable, worth approximately $450 new, which in 1919 represented about 4 months of skilled labor wages. Raymond Calder understood all of this as he stood at the edge of that pit, staring down at the machine he'd signed off on running that morning. Extraction was theoretically possible. You could winch it out, given enough anchor points and chain rigging. But the pit walls had already shown they would slump. Getting rigging equipment close enough to the edge without risking a secondary collapse was a problem that had no clean solution. The project was behind schedule. The concrete pour for that section of the foundation was due in 3 days. Every day of delay cost money the project didn't have. Arthur Haas arrived on site at 9:30 that morning. He was 44 years old, a graduate of the Armour Institute of Technology in Chicago, and he had been designing commercial and industrial buildings in central Illinois for 17 years. He walked to the edge of the pit, and he looked at the Titan. He looked at the walls. He looked at his site drawings. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something nobody expected. "Pour it in." The silence that followed was different from the silence after the tractor fell. That first silence was shock. This silence was disbelief. Calder asked him to repeat himself. Haas didn't repeat himself. He pulled out his drawings and showed Calder where the foundation wall was going to be poured. The tractor had come to rest almost exactly within the footprint of the north foundation wall section. But the angle wasn't perfect. But it wasn't catastrophic either. Haas had already done the mental geometry. The Titan's position was close enough to the wall center line that with some additional steel reinforcement placed around it, the machine could function as a regular fill mass within a heavily reinforced concrete section. It wasn't standard practice. It wasn't what any engineer would recommend from behind a desk. But Haas wasn't behind a desk. He was standing on frozen ground in October, looking at a machine that would take days to recover at significant expense and risk, and he had a foundation pour scheduled. That tractor, he reportedly told Calder, is now part of this building. The additional reinforcement steel was ordered that afternoon. 2 lengths of rebar were added to the pour specification on either side of the tractor's estimated position. The concrete work began on October 17, 1919. By the morning of the 18th, the Titan 10-20, engine, flywheel, fuel tank, steel wheels, and all, was sealed inside approximately 19 cubic yards of concrete. The building, a 2-story commercial warehouse used primarily for dry goods storage, was completed in the spring of 1920. It operated without incident for decades. Nobody who worked there in the 1930s or 1940s had any idea that a full-size tractor sat inside the north foundation wall. It wasn't exactly a fact that got passed around. Haas noted it in his project records, which were archived with his estate after his death in 1951. But those records weren't rediscovered until the building came up for demolition in 1981. When the demolition crew started breaking up the north foundation wall, they hit something dense, irregular, something that bent their hydraulic breaker teeth in a way that concrete alone doesn't. The foreman called for a halt. Somebody brought in a smaller chisel unit and started clearing carefully. What they found stopped the entire crew. The rear axle housing emerged first, then the upper edge of the drive wheel, then the fuel tank, cracked but still structurally present. The 2-cylinder engine block, encased for 62 years, came out in 3 separate sections as the surrounding concrete was removed. The flywheel was still attached. The steering column was still attached. The cast iron seat was still there. It had been sitting in that foundation since 1919, sealed against weather, against time, against everything. Parts of it had corroded significantly, but the basic form of the machine was unmistakable to anyone who knew what a Titan 10-20 looked like. The demolition company contacted a local historical society, which contacted a museum, which sent a recovery team. Several major components were salvaged, including the engine block, the flywheel assembly, and the rear differential housing. Those pieces are currently in private collection in Illinois, confirmed recovered from the 1981 demolition. Arthur Haas never mentioned the buried tractor in any of his published professional writings. His private notes described it simply as an expedient structural inclusion and not recommended for standard practice. That was the entire professional commentary of a man who had sealed a 5,700-pound piece of machinery into a building foundation to keep a project on schedule in October of 1919. Raymond Calder, the site foreman, apparently told the story at dinner tables for the rest of his life. His daughter, interviewed by a local paper in 1982 in connection with the demolition discovery, said her father described watching the concrete pour with a particular kind of quiet awe. He knew what was going down there. He watched the concrete rise around the tractor's outline, and then it was gone. Just a wall with a Titan inside it. Some decisions look like mistakes right up until the moment they don't. And sometimes the best thing you can do with a problem that won't move is build around it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button. Subscribe for more forgotten stories. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.